Hello, I'm Christian, and welcome to the Jamoir Leadership Podcast, a show where we talk about effective collaboration, influence, and leadership in an increasingly complex world. My interview partner is Dr. Dirk Schlimm. Dirk is an international leadership expert and the author of Influencing Powerful People. The purpose of this podcast is to share ideas and stimulate discussion, and it does not constitute professional advice of any kind. If such advice is needed, the services of a competent professional should be sought. The speakers, host, and Jamoir International Incorporated are not to be held responsible for any use, misuse, or reuse of the content. Enjoy the show. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Jamoir Leadership Podcast. I'm your host Christian, and I'm so glad that you're joining us. Today, Dirk and I are very pleased to be bringing on another amazing interview guest onto the channel. We are discussing energy and the energy landscape with Rory Cantwell, the CEO of SWEB Development LP. As we dive into this first of two parts, we're going to introduce Rory, hear a bit about his journey getting into the field of environmental science and how he built his career, but then we will be diving into a discussion of renewable energy, project development, and mega project management. Of course, there will be so much more, so after you listen to part one, I highly encourage that you stick around, listen to part two. We will be getting into social values, regulatory landscapes, the future of renewable energy, and of course, a favorite for many, advice that Rory can give for early career and aspiring leaders. So we're diving in now to part one. We hope that you enjoy. Welcome to today's episode, where we're thrilled to host Rory Cantwell, a leader in the field of renewable energy development. From his early days as an environmental scientist to his current role as the CEO of SWEB Development LP, Rory has been at the forefront of transforming the energy landscape in North America, particularly in Atlantic Canada. Under his leadership, SWEB is not only developing over 1,500 megawatts of renewable projects, but also integrating community values into the heart of their operations. Today, Rory will share his journey through the renewable energy sector, the nuances of project development, and his strategic vision for a sustainable future. Rory, thank you for joining us today.
Yes. Hello, Christian, Dirk. Great to be here. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm a big fan.
No, wonderful. We're so glad to get you on with a very interesting topic. So, as always, I'll start with a little intro question to get you to share a bit about your background. Then Dirk will dive in and get into some of the nitty gritty, and then I will come back with some general questions for our audience. Always likes to hear the advice of our guests on topics relating to being aspiring leaders. So, with that said, let's dive in, Rory. I want to ask you to just tell us what motivated you to get into the field of environmental science and how you built your career, and if you can, just introduce to us SWEB, and especially for our international audience, tell us a bit about Halifax and Atlantic Canada, and just give us some general context about who you are and what you're doing, please.
Sure. Well, yes, the beginning is a great place to start. I went to Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I began in doing a general science degree, got into neuroscience. And as I was progressing through that, I took some electives in nature conservation, that sort of thing. And it started making me think a bit more about what I wanted to do. I always knew health was important, but I was thinking about it more from like a pre-med direct health perspective. And then I started thinking about it a bit more broadly. And this was in the early 2000s, around when things like certain works of art were coming out, like The Corporation and Inconvenient Truth, and The Ecology of Commerce was starting to make a comeback. And I started thinking more about this growing population, globalization in a world where there is And I started thinking, okay, well, is neuroscience the right thing? So I started exploring the environmental science a bit more. I got really interested in that, and ended up being the first graduate from the program that did an area of emphasis, or sort of like a major with neuroscience. So as I wrapped up from Dal, I got into the field of environmental science. I managed a youth conservation corps program through the Nova Scotia government. I did some work as an environmental scientist, doing environmental site assessments, whereby you would evaluate the risk level of a property purchase based on ground, water, and soil quality. And then I thought, well, this is all great and a good job for that point in my life, but I was thinking I wanted to do more and put my energy behind being more of a change agent to sort of address some of the issues that I was seeing in the world, particularly related to sustainability, and thought that could be a good area to focus on. So I applied to this Masters of Renewable Resources at McGill. Got in. That was great, and started digging more into what sort of fields are out there. And found that renewable energy policy, and specifically wind energy development, really allowed me to sort of focus on this issue of internalizing environmental costs, and proactively growing a business that's new, interesting, and really met the needs of what our population needs, and that's providing electricity through renewable resources. So that got me through my education. I found a job in the industry sort of right away, my master's, and been sort of working away ever since. Now I find myself with SWEB development, and SWEB is an IPP, an independent power producer based here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We've been around for about 12 years, built our business around identifying, developing, financing, constructing, and operating renewable energy projects, mainly wind, though we dabble in solar and battery storage. And we're very focused on finding creative solutions to the climate change crisis and making sure that the community is at the forefront of project beneficiaries. And I should note that we operate about 100 megawatts of wind and solar in Eastern Canada and Northeastern United States. We were recently awarded a 95 megawatt wind project here in Nova Scotia with Glooscap First Nation, actually, and that should come online in the next couple of years. And it looks like we got a few more other good project opportunities coming down the pipes. But otherwise, our corporate parent, it's WEB. They're an Austrian community-owned energy transition company. They've been around for about 30 years, and they operate about 600 megawatts of wind, solar, and hydroelectric plants throughout Europe and North America. You asked a bit about Halifax, and Atlantic Canada. So they are very special places. People here are extremely welcoming, kind, and place high priority on community and socializing. Atlantic Canada, as you probably know, comprises Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, and Newfoundland and Labrador. Not to be confused with the Maritimes, which is the same set of provinces without Newfoundland and Labrador, but we all get along. Halifax itself is booming. I hear it's among the top growing municipalities in Canada, and actually more recently, Halifax hosted the Sail GP event, which is an international sailing race competition, much like F1. So that was held in Halifax, first time ever in Canada. It was a great race weekend, and hopefully helps put Halifax on the map a bit more. So that's a summary of where I come from, my company, and the area in which we're active.
Wow, Rory, that was amazing. That was really, really good. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know a good chunk of our audience are people early career and perhaps considering careers. So it's great to hear how you got where you are, and of course what you're doing there. Just a fantastic background, and thank you for sharing a bit about Halifax and Atlantic Canada. We do have an international audience, so that very much helps contextualize where we're talking about and what we're talking about. So perfect start. Dirk, I'm going to hand things over to you. We have the intro down. We know a bit about Rory and what he's doing. So Dirk, why don't you dive in, ask some questions, and then I'll come back at the end with some questions for general advice here.
Yeah, thanks, Christian, and Rory. Thanks for the introduction. So I should add that Rory and I actually met in Halifax, and so definitely can recommend a visit. Wonderful, wonderful city, wonderful place, and as Rory said, wonderful, wonderful people. So thank you very much for putting Halifax on the map for our international audience. But hey, let's jump into. We are in the Genoir Leadership Podcast, so let's jump into the topic of leadership, and just let's place it, Rory, into your context. So what would you say does leadership look like in the renewable energy sector? Maybe how does it differ from other industries? Maybe it doesn't, but what are your views on leadership in your context? Again, renewable energy sector, and you did emphasize the community aspect, I think, specifically with SWEB.
Yes. Great question. I mean, I've worked in renewables for the last 15, 20 years, so my experience is very specific to that, so it might be tough to comment on other industries. But what I can say is, well, I commented off the top, at least with our business, very focused on finding creative solutions to the climate change crisis and making sure those solutions have a meaningful share of benefits with the community in which they're cited. So beyond that, I think what's interesting, and I take maybe more of a historic look. I mean, when I got into renewables way back when, there was less focus on commoditization. So like having the lowest prices, there were programs in place to help support the industry and get it off. So maybe that was less of a priority at the time, and would maybe attract people more focused on sort of doing new things, R&D, sort of more experimental, but saw the greater good of the climate change cause. Now, fast forward 10, 15 years, renewables are really playing a role of being that low cost, reliable energy as well. So we're sort of competing against maybe some of our other electricity providers in the sector. So that's an interesting divergence over time. But in the meantime, renewables were always looked at to provide impeccable sort of environmental records as well as energy from renewable sources. So now we're expected to keep doing that, but also really provide that competitive price point, as well as growing a lot of the sector for jobs and so forth. So yeah, from my perspective, I think it's really attracts people that have that interest in climate change, sustainability, and also bringing the community along with you to sort of participate in the energy transition.
Yeah, and Rory, if I pick up on that, I mean, you would think, and in some way that people would love these renewable energy projects. They are critical for addressing the challenges from climate change, energy transition, and so you would think that everybody is always excited to see those projects materialize. But I think we're also aware, and you're probably aware, that's not always the case. Surprisingly, many people like the idea of a wind turbine park, but if you put it right beside my property, maybe now I don't like it so much anymore. Interesting, you mentioned the connection with First Nation. We had Bernd Christmas on the show. He's an Indigenous lawyer. He's working on these partnerships globally, actually, for Indigenous communities. And so we got a bit of a perspective from him. And so what would you say are some of the challenges you're actually facing when you're developing these, larger scale renewable energy projects, and do that in diverse jurisdictions? Is that easier here maybe versus there? Or does that differ? What's your view on some of those challenges?
Well, when we think about renewable energy development, it's a bit different than maybe other things that you would be developing or producing. Like, it's not necessarily a serial production line. Like, we like to think about it as kind of a jigsaw puzzle. So you're trying to combine these various deliverables such as securing, a real estate, your land base, making sure you're putting them in the right spot for resource adequacy, like wind speed and solar irradiance. You want to make sure you have good grid interconnection. You want to make sure you place it in an area with appropriate environmental features, so it can be put there to allow it to get permitted. And furthermore, you want to build that social license and your network throughout the community to make sure it's acceptable. And then furthermore, you bring it through design and construction, financing, and into operation once you sort of build the puzzle. So any one of those items can present a challenge as things move forward. But I think one of the biggest challenges we're seeing right now, we've got these, climate change at large, but specifically these renewable energy, renewable portfolio standards that are put in place. So for Nova Scotia, for example, they want to have 80% renewables by 2030. Federally, they talk about a decarbonized grid by 2035 and net zero emissions by 2050. So when you start thinking about those timelines, then the challenges become very apparent, especially given a wind project typically takes about 6 years from inception to operation. So if you look at the 2030 goal, we're already within that sort of 6-year window. So the biggest challenges, I think, are those limitations that would prevent us from reaching those goals, and those can be various. I mean, you can look at the grid for one. Can it handle all this transition from traditional renewable energy synchronous generation to inverter-based generation? So we have to work towards making sure the grid can handle these renewables. We have to make sure that the supply chain itself can handle this growth, right? Because not only is renewables big in Atlantic Canada, from my perspective, it's big throughout Canada, it's big throughout the US, it's big throughout Europe and the world, right? It's a very hot industry, and the people that, or the companies that provide the key materials are very few in number. It's very sophisticated companies that make these things like wind turbines, solar transformers, all those things. So that becomes a challenge. And then furthermore, you have to look at, can your public infrastructure handle it? Can the roads and ports handle these large components and get them all built out in a reasonable amount of time? And then furthermore, you got to think about the labor force. Like, can we, one of the benefits of the energy transition is all these primary and secondary and tertiary jobs that spin off from this workforce, but do we have the people sort of locally to handle that job? And are we training the workforce to really get a foothold in this industry? Otherwise, I mean, the general economic environment, I think that's something that we need to think about. Like, are the programs set up in a way to allow for and encourage growth, like, rather than, you hear this stick and carrot metaphor, like, are we doing too much stick and not enough carrot? Should we sort of incentivize and try to elicit the ingenuity of Canadians, for example? So I think that's an important piece to think about, and otherwise just making sure people and governments, more specifically, all three levels of government, are sort of working together and singing from the same songbook, essentially, whereby the municipal, provincial, and federal governments are all sort of aligned on making this significant energy transition happening. I mean, I've heard estimates from Ernst & Young that the cost of the energy transition, so to get us of net zero emissions, is somewhere in the ballpark of $2 trillion. So is it realistic in the way things are currently to sort of execute on the objectives to unlock these funds and make sure we hit those targets? So those are some of the challenges I think about specifically in meeting the goals and legislation that are in place for renewable energy targets.
Yeah, and Rory, thanks for introducing us to a massive level of complexity here, right? So you hear those pledges, and let's do this by 2030, 2040, 2050, and still looks, well, 2030 not that far away anymore, but it's easy, I guess, to make those statements when they're still 10, 15, 20 years out. But you're saying, hey, it's coming closer. It's 6 years to 2030. We are now within the project time that is is allotted. And thank you so much for making this real. The work that's actually is involved to make this happen, and the complexities you're running into. And from there, I mean, you mentioned it. These things sound like big projects. They sound like you can call them mega projects, maybe. And mega projects are notorious in being late and run over budget and don't meet the expected benefits. I was just in January in Berlin for the first time, flew out of the New Berlin International Airport, a mega project that was years late, $1 billion over budget. And here closer to home, I'm sure you heard about the Trans Mountain Pipeline that finally went into operation after many years, many billions over, and just here. So you're talking to us in Toronto. We have some rail projects here that are really late, and maybe we have some of those in Halifax also. So mega projects are notoriously late, over budget, don't always deliver, and so what broader lessons can you share from your experience to what does it take to ensure project success? You touched on a few things already, but maybe asking specifically for people who are leading mega projects, what are those key things from your perspective that will help with success in something that's very difficult to do?
Yeah, I love this topic. I think it's a fascinating one, and certainly not only do I sort of live it in what I do for work, but I do try to understand and learn from others, I suppose. And I think you really have to start off with why you are doing the project, right? Like, don't start with the answer, like this is the solution. Start with that question and really think about what your goals are and what other items should be factored in. You want to avoid these fat tail black swan events you might heard of. And to do that, you want to, well, not only thoroughly think about why you're doing the projects and factor in everything that could potentially get impacted, but you want to make sure that you're keeping that window when those bad things can strike open for as short a period as possible. And what we do to avoid that is we think, I guess we spend a lot of time in that design phase. So thinking about why we're doing the project, we put a lot of time in the design side of things, and we try to gather as much information as possible. So we think slow, and then once it's ready and we've sort of addressed all these matters, we act fast. And that's one way to avoid those challenges. So spend as much time in that area where it's okay to make mistakes, and think it through. And then once you're ready, open that window and get to work and execute. So you avoid those chances of the fat tails, black swan events. And one of the sort of essential ways to getting there is thinking about team composition. And I mean, experience is essential. We've been fortunate here at SWEB that a lot of the core team members have been working together for almost 10 years. And we really put a lot of value in corporate learning, and make sure we sort of learn these lessons together and implement those lessons into future projects, and try not to do the same mistake twice, essentially. And then furthermore, I think one of the common pitfalls is people will look at their project and think it's unique, and their project is great for all these reasons. But as the proponent behind that project, you are internally biased. So it's really important to look at the project from two perspectives. And one is the internal perspective. So why your project is what it is and why it's so great. But also you need to look at it from the external perspective. And what that means is finding sort of similar projects and seeing sort of how you compare against those projects. And there's a term for this. It's called reference class forecasting. So you understand what average projects costs and time look like, and then use that in your own design. Yes, you can tweak it if you're particularly better for some reasons, but be realistic that any number of thousand of possibilities can happen during that period where the window is open. And in order to sort of factor in one of those bad things happening, you take your reference class forecast, because then there's a good chance that one of those things happened, and you're probably, when it's all said and done, going to end up closer to that average rather than however great your project may look at the outset. So those are some of the things we try to employ to not be in that 90% number you mentioned off the top.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And it is a bit sobering. I like the think slow, act fast. And you hear those buzzwords maybe, but thanks for explaining what that means. And we're all impatient. We all want to get going. And I think the much bigger lesson here, to me, mega project or anything, is that proper planning and having things laid out and having considered what goes wrong. And yes, we want to go in with enthusiasm and confidence, but hey, those things, and you have that it's likely that something is going to come your way that you don't expect. So I think that's a good lesson and good thoughts there for anything really that a leader might do.
All right, everyone, I'm going to jump in and pause the discussion here. What a great part one of a two-part series with Rory Cantwell. So I encourage you, wherever you're listening to this podcast, already uploaded is part 2 of the discussion. We encourage you to listen to that, as we will be diving into the conversation topics of Atlantic Canada's role in the renewable energy landscape. We'll be talking about integrating values such as community and environmental values in SWEB's energy projects. We'll be looking at navigating regulatory landscapes and the future of renewable energy. Of course, you're going to want to catch part 2, because we'll also be hearing Rory's advice for those early career and aspiring leaders. So we hope that you'll stick around. Part 2 already uploaded. See you there.